All right, ladies and gentlemen, here we go. Chapter 1 of the Civil Rights Movement documentary that you should be checking out. So, guys, again, hopefully you heeded my warning about the fact that this is some rather tough history, right? Like the hatred that we see on the part of too many people back in those days is a very difficult thing to watch. And sadly, I mean, we know that that still exists today, right? So let's talk about the civil rights movement. So really, when we think about the civil rights movement, we think of people like Rosa Parks and Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., but the seeds for the civil rights movement were planted way before what we consider to be the modern civil rights movement of the 1950s and 1960s in the United States of America. So just a quick little backstory here. In 1619, we see slavery come to the British 13 colonies. And then in 1776, of course, these 13 colonies declare their independence on the 4th of July from the British Crown. And of course, we get from that is the War of Independence. And then we have the establishment of the United States of America, written constitution, and we see the idea of liberty and equality being entrenched into these American founding documents. Yet, sadly, that liberty and equality was not extended to people of African descent. Now, fast forward a little bit more, and we get to the presidency of one Abraham Lincoln. And of course, guys, Abraham Lincoln, he was a politician originally. He was also a lawyer, but he is sort of the guy who gets the ball rolling on the abolition of slavery. But before we get to that, let's talk about question number 1. So number 1 says, what war in American history was fought over the issue of slavery? That war, of course, was the American Civil War. The American Civil War lasted from 1861 to 1865. Now, it's called the Civil War because of the fact that it was Americans fighting and killing Americans, much like what we saw with the Russian Civil War right after the Bolshevik Revolution. In the United States of America, the issue here in the American Civil War was slavery. Should human beings be able to own other human beings as property? And the North, right, known as the Union side, said no. And the South, known as the Confederate side, said yes. Now, number 2 says, which side of the war wanted to keep slavery and why? Well, I just mentioned that. That would be the Southern or the Confederate side. Why did they want to keep slavery? Well, because slavery was incredibly important to the Southern economy. The Southern economy, where we had cash crops like tobacco and cotton, amongst others, was reliant upon slavery in order to keep its economy profitable, right? From a capitalist perspective, if you can make your employees work for free, then you keep labor costs insignificant, right? They don't matter. They're nothing. They're free. I mean, morally speaking, slavery is a terrible thing, but economically speaking, for the South, it made sense, right? And when President Lincoln spoke about being against slavery, then the South became rather nervous. And they, in 1861, actually 7 Southern states declared themselves the Confederate States of America. So yes, we actually had a declaration by American states for their own independence from the United States of America, which is kind of crazy. So the Civil War was all about trying to keep the Union together. That's what Lincoln wanted to achieve. He wanted to keep the Union together, and the South, believing in what's known as states' rights, believed that they should be allowed to have laws which were accepting of slavery, right? It's a states' rights issue. Now, of course, in the end, 1865, the war is won by the North. And of course, that is after the Emancipation Proclamation. And that's in number 3. Which president declares the Emancipation Proclamation? Just so you guys know, to be emancipated means to be made free. Lincoln in 1863, January 1st, declares the Emancipation Proclamation during the American Civil War. And what it was basically the promise that anyone who's a slave in any southern state, should the North win the war, you will be free. And it actually caused a large number of African American people to join the Union's side so that slavery can be ended and that the southern states, the Confederacy, can be defeated. Now, after the war, we get something known as the Reconstruction Era. So after 1865, after the Civil War is over, right, we get the Southern General Robert E. Lee, who surrenders to the Union commander, a guy by the name of Ulysses S. Grant. He accepts General Lee's resignation, and we enter into the Reconstruction Era. So the South loses the war. Now we have to bring America back together. We have to reconstruct and reheal those wounds which were created by the American Civil War. Now, there was 3 constitutional amendments that were added to the American Constitution once the war was over, and they were as follows. There was the blessing of freedom. We see the right to citizenship for formerly disenfranchised slaves, in addition to the right to due process, legal protection under the law. And then we also see the right to vote, right? And that freedom comes in the 13th Amendment. That citizenship and due process guaranteed to former slaves is in the 14th Amendment. And then in the 15th Amendment, we see the right for all people to be able to vote. Now, number 5, describe, or why did the Ku Klux Klan or KKK form? So almost immediately after the Southern loss in the American Civil War, we see the formation of this group known as the Ku Klux Klan or the KKK. So the Ku Klux Klan was formed to, quote, redeem the South and to reestablish the racial hierarchy that was seen in the American South. Remember, guys, for decades, we had black people in the American South owned as property. And now that we had the Civil War being completed, those people were now free. And people in the South, the whites in the South, were threatened by the fact that all of a sudden it seemed like white people and black people were on the same social plane, and they didn't like that. So the Ku Klux Klan was formed to basically sort of put black people into their place, as terrible as that sounds, because obviously it is. But that's what it was all about. And guys, the Klan was a terrorist organization, and it still is, right? The things that they engage in, the hatred that they display for people of different skin tones is just like, it's so ridiculous. I'll never understand hating someone for the color of their skin instead of who they are as a human being, like deep down, right? Their beliefs and things like that. But anyways, that's the Ku Klux Klan. Now, number 6, describe Jim Crow laws as seen in the South. So beyond the KKK, after the American Civil War ends and we enter into the Reconstruction Era, we see the formation or the creation of these things called Jim Crow laws. Now, just so you know, Jim Crow was a minstrel character, right? A cartoon character. Now, minstrel, I don't know if you've ever seen it or not, but it used to be where white people would dress up as black people and put like shoe shine on their face and darken themselves and get into what we know today as blackface. And they would act in foolish manners, right? They would act like they're buffoons, and it was to make fun of black people, right? That was the whole point of this here. So Jim Crow was a minstrel character, and these Jim Crow laws were created in the American South to basically keep white people and black people totally separate. So in the South, we saw separate drinking fountains, we saw separate buses or separate parts of buses, separate trains, separate schools, separate churches, separate restaurants, separate everything. The whole point here was to, again, establish that racial hierarchy between white people and black people. And then we see our first real test of these Jim Crow laws. So in 1892, a man by the name of Homer Plessy gets onto a whites-only train car in Ferguson, Louisiana, and he is told to get off, and he refuses. So the police show up, they drag him out of the train car, and then he faces a court date. At court, he is given a $25 fine. Now, I know that sounds like not a lot of money, but remember, it's 1892, and most black people at this time were of rather meager means. Why? Well, because of Southern Jim Crow laws, which kept them undereducated, which meant that they couldn't have good jobs, right? So this $25 fine was a big deal. So Plessy, he appeals to the Louisiana appellate courts, and it gets rejected. They're like, nope, sorry. And then it goes all the way to the Supreme Court of the United States. And by a court ruling of 7-1, the Supreme Court of the United States, remember guys, the Supreme Court, are part of the legislative branch, or sorry, the judicial branch of government in the United States. Their job is to, reflect the Constitution, reflect American principles and values. And what the Supreme Court said in the Plessy versus Ferguson case in 1896 now, so 4 years after when the actual arrest happened, the Supreme Court said that Jim Crow laws were legal, that segregation by law was legal as long as it was, quote, separate but equal. And the one lone dissenting judge of this particular case called it like one of the gravest miscarriages of justice in the United States of America. And it's still today thought of as one of the worst Supreme Court decisions in the history of the United States Supreme Court. So anyways, let's talk about this idea of separate but equal. So number 8, it says describe separate but equal. Separate but equal was established in the Supreme Court case of Plessy versus Ferguson. And while separate was a definite truth, right? Again, separate water fountains, separate churches, separate schools, separate parts of the bus, separate parts of the train, right? Like total segregation in all aspects of life. Equal was not true, right? You're definitely separate if you are a black person in the United States under these Jim Crow laws, but you are definitely not equal. The schools that black children went to were atrocious, right? The water fountains they drank from were disgusting. The bathrooms they had to go to were vile. The parts of the bus that they rode in were not as well kept as the white parts of the bus. And eventually what we'll see, guys, is different groups in the United States, like the NAACP, challenge this idea of separate but equal. All right, that is chapter 1. Moving on to chapter 2 here right away, folks. Hope you're liking this. Miss you guys, love you guys, and take it easy.